Hello. I'd like to welcome everybody for tuning in today. My name is Dr. Mike Ryan. I am the program coordinator at WVU in the Athletic Coaching Education Program. I am also a head cross-country coach at Morgantown High School and assistant track. So I do a little academia and a little coaching on the side too. Today's talk is going to focus really on the return to play and some of the best practices that coaches, parents, and athletes need to think about for their safety, their school safety, and their community safety. For ones that don't know, the WVU Center for Applied Coaching and Sports Science, which we kind of refer to here as the center, is a collection of faculty, staff, students from the College of Physical Education and Sports Sciences at West Virginia University. All right, so I'm going to start off by introducing some of our panel members. First off, Dr. Brendan Basic from WVU Medicine. He is a team physician here at WVU and for East Fairmont High School. We have Chris Parsons, which is the athletic director at Cabell Midland High School and longtime track and cross country coach. As a coach, he's probably won more state championships than I have, fingers and toes, in his very long career. We also have Trevor Jones, which is a physical therapist and athletic training coordinator for HealthWorks Rehab and Fitness. Dr. Charbonneau is WVU Athletics Director of Clinical and Sports Psychology. Dr. Guy Hornsby is the WVU weightlifting coach and is also faculty in the Athletic Coaching Education Program. And finally, we have Dr. Kristen Diefenbach, which led us in here. She's an associate professor in the Athletic Coaching Education Program and director of the center. So the first question I have for the panel, and I'll let you guys introduce yourselves a little bit more if I made any mistakes in there as we get going, is really when we think about the current situation that we're in right now, we have a lot of information coming from a lot of different sources. So what are the main sources or resources that you look to for information, both regarding the disease and well, the return to play? And what are some of those sources saying about letting athletes get back into action?
So I'll take first stab there. So again, my name is BJ Balsick. I'm one of the team physicians at WVU and also help out at East Fairmont High School. So there's a couple big medical sports medicine societies in the country, the American Medical Society for Sports Medicine, and then the American College of Sports Medicine, as well as the NCAA. We're looking towards some guidance about return to play. Unfortunately, that often, we're getting more questions than answers with a lot of this stuff. There's the guidelines right now are basically geared at phasing in return to play, developing policies for screening, developing policies for sanitation, potentially for testing. Unfortunately, there's no hard, fast rules that have come out just yet. I think that's pretty obvious when we have difficulty with professional sports not coming out how they're going to return to play just quite yet. Again, because I think there's more questions than answers right now. But I think the unifying idea across the board is a phased return, and then developing these policies for sanitation and screening going forward.
Coach Parsons is the athletic director at Cabell Midland, taking a different approach to this, one as an athletic administrator at a high school.
Well, with us, everything's a big question mark, and with this pandemic, everything seems to change day to day or week to week. I know right now, who we listen to a lot is, we've got to go by what the WVSSAC, who governs our high schools, and what they're doing. I just got an email today from them, what they do. They're working with the National Federation of High School, who has come out with some guidelines about, reopening and about how many people, can work out. And and again, they're going through 3 phases like the NCAAs. It's not as in depth, but I know right now it's like if you do come back in phase 1, which from reading the email today, it looks like maybe mid-June, and everything will be outdoors. And then the numbers would be 10 or less. And so, you know, that's who we do. And then what the SSAC will do, they'll govern between each county, because let's say in Jefferson County or a county that's far away, the virus spikes up. They don't want, you know, in Cabell County where we're at, numbers might be real low. So we could continue to, you know, train, you know, conditioning. So right now, nothing sport specific. We're just looking at conditioning. Most people, that 3-week period that they allow you to do sport specific training, most counties, I know Cabell County, instead of doing the first 3 weeks in June, we have moved those to the last 3 weeks of July. That's if we even get to do that. So right now it's just a big uncertainty exactly where we're going. And I'm getting all the questions too, you know, and being a coach, it's questions that I would be asking, but it's basically, it's a wait and see game right now.
Trevor Jones, who is a physical therapist and athletic training coordinator at HealthWorks Rehab.
Yes, so Trevor Jones, I'm a physical therapist here at HealthWorks, and I'm the director of our athletic training services. So we service the local high schools in both Mon County and Marion County, in addition to WVU Club Sports and Intramurals. So, you know, we typically follow the NATA, or the National Athletic Trainers Association. And as of yet, there hasn't really been any sort of position statement they put out. So you know, after reading through the NFHS guidelines, I mean, in an ideal world, you know, they're pretty good about social distancing. I think from an athletic trainer's perspective, managing for our high schools, for instance, is going to be challenging, making sure, you know, having smaller lifting groups, maintaining the same lifting groups together, so you're minimizing exposure to other athletes. So, you know, obviously you have, you know, anywhere from freshmen through seniors and different levels of maturity, and making sure they understand the reasoning behind some of the distancing and minimizing some of the lifting groups, different running groups and things like that. You know, as of right now, I think we're going to try to have, you know, masks for our athletic trainers and managing limiting their exposure and exposure to the athletes through the athletic trainers. So from that perspective, you know, it's all about setting a good example and trying to figure out what the best way is to managing some of the social distancing aspects.
Dr. Charbonneau, which is the WVU Athletics Director for Clinical and Sports Psychology, taking a little different approach, looking at the psyche of both athletes coming into this and coaches, administrators.
Yeah, thanks. Nice to meet you all. I'm Dana. Like you already said, I'm the Director of Clinical and Sports Psychology in our athletics department, and I also do have a connection to our counseling center on campus, so I think that's a little unique perspective for me as well, obviously following NCAA kind of recommendations and at the Big 12 level as well, but also looking at, you know, the American Psychological Association too, and thinking about from a behavioral health perspective, you know, what's it going to look like when we also come back and we're adjusting to this quote unquote new normal, whatever that's going to look like. I think we talk about testing a lot and what that's going to look like. And I think we have to think about how we're going to add mental health into that, right? Kind of seeing where our athletes are at when they're coming back, how they have been coping throughout the pandemic, how they're feeling about coming back to a different situation. I think we know a lot of folks are excited to come back, but I think there also can be some hesitancy there and just not knowing what that's going to look like. So from like the American Psychological Association, Association for Applied Sports Psychology, also just my colleagues in similar positions that I am in, thinking about how we can assess for some of that when folks get back, and also just ongoing assessment as we continue to adjust as these phases unfold. I think that's going to be really important. For me also, just as a psychologist, you know, I have to think about at what point, you know, will we transition to in-person sessions versus what we've been doing virtually and that kind of thing. So just some pieces on my end from the mental health side.
Thank you. Dr. Guy Hornsby, which is a professor here at WVU, is also the WVU weightlifting coach and strength and conditioning, and a strength and conditioning coach.
Thanks, Mike. So yeah, I think for myself personally, I sort of have two hats with this. One is as a coach and as a weightlifting coach. Weightlifting is kind of unique. I always describe it to those unfamiliar as it's a sport that isn't in the NCAA, and yet it's in the Olympic Games. And so I have some athletes that are very, very committed to the sport. They identify as weightlifters, but we don't have that NCAA or WIVSAC or, that type. We have an NGB and that's it. We also don't compete very often. And so, my sort of big push in the beginning was to make sure as best I could help them get good training situations. And it's nice that weightlifting is something that if you have the right equipment, you can do it at home. And so while gyms have opened up and a lot of our lifters have been dispersed from Morgantown into a whole bunch of different places, depending on the state, their gym situation can be different. And so I'm trying to work with them on that. But at the same time, because I felt pretty good after the first week or two of getting them all situated, I see it as not needing to be in a rush to get going again into a gym. Then more on the research academic side, I've contributed to some papers in the past and have been contributing on one recently that gets more at the training and assessment part of this. And so I think that when you look at the different phases, the once the athletes get back, how do you assess strength levels, training status, all of those types of things. And that's certainly a discussion unto itself that can get into a whole bunch of different areas. I think that one of the biggest things to this is ideally going into the COVID-19 situation, ideally you were doing some good monitoring beforehand. And that's not always the case. And so coming up with some batteries that might be brand new and what can that tell you versus if you've been doing some serial monitoring before everyone had to disperse.
All right, thank you. And our final panelist here is Dr. Kristen Diefenbach. She is, like I said, here at WVU too. So tell us about some of the organizations that you are in tune to and are listening to when they're giving out advice, and what are they saying?
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Certainly it's been an all-consuming couple of weeks, and I probably spend somewhere between 3 to 5 hours a week in calls with different coaching education groups, with the national governing bodies of sport like USA Hockey, USA Swimming, USA Tennis, as well as with the coach educator groups and coach developer groups from around the country. And we're sitting in a situation where, as BJ said, there is tons of information coming out, but no one really knows what's going to happen and where it's going. And so we have a lot of preliminary information in bits and pieces, and a lot of people chomping at the bit to return to normal. And yet from the leadership perspective, both nationally and internationally, there's a general consensus that just like sport has always done, there's going to be some evolution. It's just going to be faster and perhaps less welcome than other evolutions that we've had to do in sport, with big concerns around sports like wrestling, where contact is very, very high. Less concern perhaps with our distance runners, but still concerning. And the conversation right now is really focusing around how do we make it as safe as possible, knowing that some of the greatest risk is going to occur in the peripheries of sport, the spectators, the locker rooms, the waiting rooms, all of those places. So trying to monitor all those statements that are coming out from the NFHS, National Federation of High Schools, the Olympic groups, the NGBs of sport is a lot of stuff to pay attention to. And that's one of the reasons why we put together this panel, and the center is working to try to keep people informed.
All right, thank you, Kristen. So I'm gonna put the next question. This is one from the audience here, and really to the entire panel. What are questions that because I know there's a lot of parents out there that are concerned. What are specific questions that parents should be asking coaches, administrators?
I think, a big question that needs to be asked is how are these athletes going to be screened? Are they going to be screened? What criteria will be used? I know there's a big push to do temperature checks in a lot of areas, but we know that you don't have to have a fever to actually carry COVID. So that's only a piece of the puzzle. Another thing I would ask is how facilities, how equipment's going to be cleaned. Because if you think about weightlifting, are you going to wipe down equipment after each person? So I think that's another big question that if I was a parent, I'd be asking. just to kind of slow the spread.
Kind of a follow-up to that, which what you just kind of mentioned there, asking athletes. Trevor or Guy, do you want to answer this one in there? But are there any liability concerns about having maybe 15, 16-year-olds wiping down equipment?
Yeah, I think, I think as long as there's a really big education piece with that, if you're teaching them how to clean equipment, if you're doing it before and after each spot, I mean, if you're kind of doubling up that way, a good way to minimize liability. But I think in addition to each individual athlete wiping down and cleaning machines, et cetera, having a professional, whether it's an athletic trainer or somebody on the strength and conditioning staff, doing a thorough cleaning in between groups as well, I think that's the best way to minimize risk.
I would also say I think that's one of the things that coaches have to take on a big responsibility for, and that's a big responsibility if you're a volunteer position especially, but learning about what exactly that means, not just here's the list of things to wipe down, but what does it mean to do it well, and what's that expectation. There's a level of responsibility that's coming with this that hasn't been a part of perhaps what we've done in the past.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that as you think about weight rooms and locker rooms and how they're often not the cleanest of places. We're finding out even with the work that we do with the high schools that you ask about, is there a janitorial staff person assigned to the weight room, the locker room? No is a very common answer to that. And so, the amount of cleaning supplies you might need is something we've been discussing recently. And I think, there probably, like a lot of this stuff, isn't a perfect answer, but a well-discussed, thorough protocol, planning ahead, and materials in the understanding of you might be going through a whole lot of whatever the cleaning agent may be, gloves, towels, all of that kind of stuff. How are you going to dispose of them? All of those things that, I mean, I've much more commonly seen, like in a S&C scenario, strength coaches are often just, they do it themselves. And it'll be interesting to see, hopefully that the places that can do it, that they have the janitor staff and some more power behind doing the cleaning, that it's not all on it.
Yeah, I think when you look at, cleaning, I can tell you from a perspective of our physical therapy staff, there's a couple different ways you can look at it. When you read just on Clorox wipes, for example, which are the easiest things to use and you can't actually find anywhere right now, there's a couple different criteria that you can look at. There's sanitizing, which is only 15 seconds that the machine or whatever the surface has to stay wet, or there's disinfecting, which you have to leave that surface wet for 4 minutes with a Clorox wipe. So if you're looking at that and trying to move athletes through in a strength and conditioning period, you're looking at a lot of downtime just waiting for things to dry. So each substance, each cleaning agent has a different downtime. So when you're looking at, we have a yellow spray, it's called Quat. That's 10 minutes that surface has to stay wet. So we've actually moved to a bleach different disinfectants. So it's actually 1,000 parts per million per the CDC. So that's only 1 minute wait time. And that's just, they say that amount of wait time can actually kill COVID. So looking at what the actual cleaning agent recommends for disinfecting is something to look at as well.
Kind of piggybacking on that same question, but now thinking about what should questions that coaches be asking. I'll start with you, Coach Parsons, because you are an administrator and AD. What are your coaches asking you, and for the rest of the panel, what are questions that coaches should be asking from administrators?
Well, I know I've already, I've talked to several of our coaches, and especially coming back into phase one that we've kind of talked about is everything's got to be outdoors. But one area that we did talk about, and it's like bathrooms. Even if you're outdoors, and one of your athletes has to go to the bathroom or whatever, how are you going to clean that? How are you going to do the stalls? That is some stuff that we're working on. Do we hire a custodian to be at our at our practices. So when someone goes in, we make sure that gets cleaned properly and that, and then, are you really putting that custodian at risk? Or do they want to do that? So that those are questions, that the coaches are asking. The big one that a lot of coaches ask me is, is there going to be a season? Is there going to be a season? And you know, that's the golden question, and I don't have the answer to that. Right now it's just according who you talk to. You got to listen to the experts is the big thing, and right now I just don't know that. And then if we do have a season, what kind of season is it going to be? Are we going to just have players out there and nobody in the stands and do more of a pay-per-view type deal? And I don't think anybody really wants that. So until we know more, about this virus and how to get it under control and stuff, I think that's an answer that only time's going to be able to tell. But those are questions I'm getting. The biggest one is, do you think we're going to have a season? But with that being said, I had a good talk with our football coach, and we're looking at the mental aspect to our athletes who are used to working out, used to doing things. And now they can't. Well, it's not that they can't, but they're going to have to do it on their own, or like you say, go to some of these gyms that are just now opening and all that. Our thoughts are, we would rather, and we don't want to open up too soon, but we would rather have them come to us where we have total control, where we're held accountable. We take it, and and it's like our coaches, and I've sent emails out, there's no room for error. You gotta really educate before we start this up. Everyone has to be educated, everyone has to be on the same page, and there's no room for error. And if you can't follow these guidelines, then basically, if we find one sport's not living up to these standards or whatever, then that sport's, they're not going to practice. So we're all going to be on the same page, and we take it very serious. I mean, we don't want to put our athletes at risk, but at the same token, these athletes like working out, whether they're competing or not, just the feel of after you get done with a good workout, how you feel. So that has been a concern of ours, of how our young people right now are dealing with this mentally, of not being back to some type of normal.
Dana, on that same note, when he talks about the mental aspect of the sport and coming back to play and the togetherness, our society is pretty politically divided on some of these issues that are coming up. How does a coach deal with athletes who may be all into going right back to normal, and you have some athletes or some parents that are worried or concerned about sending their kids back to sports?
Yeah, good question. I think it's going to be so helpful to think about how we're going to have open communication, right? And providing the opportunity for our athletes to be sharing how they're feeling when they come back, but also how they're doing, like we said, as it unfolds, and having that ongoing conversation, because things could change over time. I mean, what happens if one of my teammates gets the virus, 4 or 5 weeks in or something like that, and now I'm all of a sudden afraid that I might get it as well? So things can unfold in different ways and can change. And so how are we talking about that? And then how do we also know what the resources are going to be in place for helping some of our student athletes that are going to have a wide range of experiences? And I think it's important to remember that our athletes can have multiple feelings at once, right? So some of your athletes can be excited to return and at the same time a little hesitant, right? So they can both be there at once. It doesn't have to be a one or the other kind of thing. So just as long as they're feeling like they have the space to talk about that, I think it'll be really helpful. I think I heard, I think it was our athletic director talk in a recent interview that I thought was relating it to injury, how sometimes in the past, athletes are afraid to disclose injuries if they're worried of coming across as weak, or is that going to impact my ability to train or my ability to play? And I think it's going to be interesting now. This is something that we can't hide from everyone, right? We have to let people know if we're feeling sick. And I would also encourage us to for our athletes too, to let people know when you're feeling like not great emotionally, right? If you are afraid, these are some things that we need to get out there in the open so we can provide, again, support, provide resources to help people feel like they're able to come back in a way that feels safe and comfortable for them.
Mike, to piggyback on that a little bit in your previous question of what coaches should be asking, that is one of those key things I think coaches should be asking the administration. What are the support resources if I'm concerned about my athletes or even your own well-being as a coach? What are the resources that are through your school or your system or other places? Because this is not just a return to the physical environment. There's a lot of other stuff that comes with this that coaches may not have the resources and parents may not have the resources or know where to connect these dots.
I had one come up here, and it was kind of dealing with that same thing that Dana said. What do we do? And this might be for BJ or Trevor. What do we do if a kid does test positive?
Yeah, that's a great question. We at the medical staff at WVU talk about that every day, multiple times a day. So the general thought is that athlete gets quarantined. Now, how long that quarantine is, I don't know. Is it 7 days? Is it 14 days? And then the question arises, do you base it on when they come back? Do you base it on when their symptoms resolved? Do you base it off a negative test, which we know from the media, there are people that have been testing positive for 8 weeks. So that's another question that needs to be answered. And then I think to even expand upon that is do you pull teammates? So let's say you have a football player, offensive lineman, and we're in phase 3, test positive. Do you pull all of his defensive linemen and offensive lineman counterparts? So that's another big question that we've been asking. And again, nobody's really coming up with a good answer, but right now I think you err on the side of caution and you just have to pull them.
Yeah, I think from the high school perspective, we'll kind of follow the lead of kind of what WVU is doing and looking at what some of the other national recommendations are. I know from our perspective of some of the employees that we've had is, unless you're symptomatic, you can't really get tested. So even if you're around somebody that tests positive, unless you're exhibiting symptoms, we can't find out if you're positive, until that point. So that's what makes this difficult.
I popped into the chat for anyone who's interested. John Hopkins has created a very nice free resource for anybody who's interested in better understanding that contact tracing concept and how that works through, knowing that as coaches and administrators, we're certainly not the health organizations that need to do this, but we're talking to people and we may have to be sharing information about exposure that we become aware of.
And I'll ask this to the entire panel, when we look at, if again, kind of that piggyback on the same thing, if somebody does come down with, maybe not say necessarily they have tested positive for it, but they come down with signs and symptoms of COVID-19, what responsibility do we have, or can we even legally talk about that with other parents, teammates? Where do we step in and where do we turn this over to the local officials?
I think that's another great question. I think there's going to be a change in kind of the mentality that you play, even though you're sick, you still come to practice and you still play as long as you don't have a fever and you're not vomiting. I think that's going to change. And people are going to be encouraged to stay home when that happens, even if they're not COVID positive. I think, when it comes down to sharing that health information, that's a very tricky subject. And I think, it's just going to have to be, discussed that, hey, there's somebody who has symptoms, and it's going to be up to, maybe the team, the administration to further relay that information.
I think from an athletic training perspective, I think we're definitely going to have to err on the side of caution. So, I think it'll be a discussion with team physicians about what symptoms, maybe their higher red flags versus their yellow flags. And, the student athletes and their parents are probably going to have to be in close contact with whether it's, primary care, pediatricians, and kind of seeing if they would qualify to get tested or if they need to see somebody immediately. Because that's going to be the tricky part, just having one sign or one symptom. Whereas maybe, hey, you're coughing, you're sneezing, you may have easily practiced or played through that, but now that may be something, okay, you need to talk to a licensed professional now.
EJ, that's interesting you brought that up about, what we can protect in terms of health information and what we can't. From the psychological side of things, it was interesting that we just heard from a legislative perspective that public health legislation would override some of our rules in terms of confidentiality of a client identity. So if I was informed that someone I met with in person was diagnosed, or if I came down with it or anything like that, I was told that we will have to disclose that person's name. So we would be able to figure out all of those people that were in contact. So that could potentially be different, but that was just something interesting for me, that public health right now seems to be overriding some of those rules.
Speaking of those, I have and I know the National Federation of High Schools just came out with this week, and Coach Parsons talked about this earlier, and they kind of tiered sports into risk categories based on contact. So we had a question coming here. For contact sports such as basketball, what recommendations or protocols should coaches implement to reduce viral transmission as they prepare for eventual gameplay?
We had an interesting conversation with the guys at USA Hockey recently, as they were trying to sort some of that out within their sport. And while people do wear, helmets with either the grill on it or perhaps the plexiglass face piece, they don't think that's sufficient. And they've been trying to use some of the GPS data to figure out how much contact actually occurs on the ice and how often the skaters are actually within 6 feet of each other. And they're finding that it's relatively minimum. Now you're going to get into a sport like basketball and it's going to be a lot greater. And right now there's sort of that back and forth between how much can you do in small group drills, how much can you do to run practices that are maybe based on more of a small-sided game or a personal skill development perspective, and wait a little bit before you start doing the kinds of drills that require the more intense one-on-one contact, until we get a little bit better handle on ways to do this. So there are ways to do practice. It may just not be all of the things you normally do, while we're beginning to collect some of this data and figure out, is the risk that high on the court? Is it more just in the locker room? Where are we sort of coming in that space? So I would recommend, keep the kids active. You don't want to go back to the old lines and drills, but how can you reduce that interaction and the bumping in your practices right now?
Yeah, I think when you look at some of those, when you look at heavy exertion, we were talking to one of the occupational medicine physicians over at WVU, and they were even saying with heavy exertion, you can extend that 6-foot barrier almost up to 26 feet. I mean, so you're looking at some of these gyms like basketball or even hockey. I mean, you have people running around, 26 feet, you're going to have people in very quickly. So obviously there's not necessarily evidence for that for COVID in particular, but it's just something that we keep in mind when you're thinking about, hey, 6 feet's, a number that we have out there.
And I think that becomes a really important conversation that we all personally have to think about. How much risk? There's always risk in sport. There's risk in everything. How much risk? Because here it's not just a personal risk. There's a large community public health risk, as Dana was saying with some of the conversations. What's it worth in terms of rushing back and returning to full sport when we don't know so much? And how do we balance some of that out? And those are conversations that I think we've been skirting around as a culture, but we're going to have to start going into a little bit more. The short term versus the long term, individual versus the group.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's going to be a larger topic going forward in terms of risk. From the professional leagues, there have been baseball players that have come out and said they're not willing to risk it at this point. And even at the college level, we're going to have that discussion, and it's going to filter down, high school, youth. I mean, there's going to be a risk there, and like you said, how much is it worth?
And it's good when a lot of times we think about this risk and we're thinking mainly about those athletes involved, but we also have to take into account that a lot of the coaches, officials, administrators at those schools, they're going to be more susceptible to this, to the disease, at least to some of the complications dealing with the disease, than our young athletes are themselves. Guy, this is changing gears a little bit, and think about when athletes do come back to action. We're going to have athletes with varying levels of and physical fitness. Some of them have been doing a lot on their own. Some of them have been doing very little. None of them would have, or most of them, I would say, probably haven't been lifting heavy weights in a weight room. What would be some of your suggestions about getting all those athletes on your team back up to a similar level so that you can actually conduct a hour and a half practice?
Yeah, I think when you get into the details of that, a lot of it will depend on what the sport is, the demands of the sport, how long do you have? We look at the injury rates of fall sports after coming back from a summer. Those sports tend to be higher. Those injury rates tend to be higher in freshmen compared to returners. I think it is helpful to look at, while we have certainly not faced something like the pandemic, we do have a lot of injury data out there. There are some really good studies on detraining. There's really good position statement papers from NSCA, CSCCA. There's a really good one that was a joint effort between NSCA and NATA. There's been stuff out there dealing with transition periods. So we not only are there certain times where we tend to find injuries that are training related to be higher, a new coaching staff comes in. We've seen that over and over again, and there are some big cases where real bad things have happened related to that. We've seen things in terms of sport coach's influence on the strength and conditioning. But I think, to back up just in terms of assessment and monitoring, I think that ideally is a huge part of this. And it's interesting to be contacted by various places more recently and getting questions about monitoring and assessment. And the first question I always ask is, well, what have you been doing? What were you doing before they left? And it's often, well, we weren't, but we need to do something now for when they come back. I think certainly assessment it's better to do that in some form or fashion when they return, but ideally you would have some good data to go off of from when they left. And you may have, I think one of the more challenging things is, because everything kind of happened like that. For us, it was, all right, spring break is in a couple days and they're not coming back. So, you may have, like, if it's the end of the spring semester, okay, this is when we test these teams. And so you may have missed like the last month and a half, 2 months, something like that. But there are some really good ways to get ideas of training status in terms of, so some of it is what's your budget, what devices, but there are very low-tech, cheap options in terms of vertical jump assessment, some conditioning tests where, you pull them based on time, things related to fatigue. I'm a big fan of vertical jump testing because there's some really good stuff out there on if you compare unloaded to loaded, and the loaded condition being just, it could be as light as a barbell. Weaker athletes tend to fall off a lot in jump height, if you can only measure jump height, but if you have a force plate like we work with at WVU, you can get some other variables that are nice, like power output. And so, that gets at things related to non-contact injuries, soft tissue injuries, the idea that weaker athletes don't handle braking forces, eccentric forces as well. And so I guess there's a couple things with that. One is you can get some idea from that what their training status is. You can get some idea of their strength levels. And if you have, and you can also get an idea of if they are pretty well trained. So we know that really well trained athletes from a strength power standpoint will perform vastly differently. Like power output, for example, with a barbell actually will be higher compared to the unloaded condition. for relatively weak athletes, you'll see a drop off. And so there are actually some like digging into the numbers types things that you can do. And then I think that there's even some parallels we can draw. And I think it's helpful to look at situations we have been in before, like they've been gone over winter break and didn't do what they weren't able to train or didn't train. They detrained over the summer for several months. That we have some examples to go on. And I think that hopefully the NCAA allows probably longer training periods to allow a ramp up, a build up. And then I think this might not have been as extreme as it is maybe now, but if you look at particularly, and I keep saying fall sports, a week and a half, 2 weeks in, we have a scrimmage, and then a week later we have another scrimmage, and then we have our first game. It's basically that amplified a lot, and coaches are often put in very tough situations of, I got to evaluate my team. I got to do certain things at practice. They have to be in shape. And, I think coaches hopefully will be able to be very cautious and err on the side of planning out that slow ramp up, using assessment to move forward with that ramp up, and then not feeling that we have to do this, this, and this before the first game. It might not be a good idea to do that.
I think there's a really essential piece there to pull out at the end, that you can't go back into training, whether it's 3 weeks in June, 3 weeks in July, or in the fall, with the assumption that it's going to be like any other return after any other break. That as a coach, you need to be really aware that you've got to go a little bit more slowly for so many reasons. The athlete's fitness level, the safety issues, not quite sure how it's going to work. It's going to require you as a coach and as a sport parent to really think about sort of the soft re-entry, right? Not just like we normally do, hit August and all of a sudden just get slammed with 2-a-days. Soft entry would be what I'd recommend.
And there, Kristen, if I could jump in too, there are some things out there that are good recommendations to quantify some of this stuff in terms of training and building up, and some information out there about large spikes very rapidly in training volume leading to more injuries. Weaker athletes tend to be much more susceptible to some of the non-contact stuff when they become fatigued. So, you could have a strong athlete and a weak athlete. They're both really fatigued from the training of the last week or so, but they might not be at the same injury potential situation.
Kind of piggybacking on that same injury concept, Trevor, what are some things that coaches and parents should be looking for as their athlete gets back into play that would be red flags, not so much COVID stuff, but more injury related or fatigue related? And then I'm going to turn this question over to Dana, and what should we be looking for about mental fatigue?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can even look at just, demeanor. Does the child or athlete, are they appearing more fatigued? Are they carrying themselves the same? Are they exhibiting, you mentioned the mental fatigue, that aspect of things. I think what we really want to kind of look into, if possible, is trying to set some sort of at-home training program to where, they're not going straight into a 100% workout mode. You're hoping that each program is ramping up from an appropriate level to try to capture, whether you're looking at freshmen, sophomores, seniors, whatever, but they may be entering at a higher level than they may be ready for. So, if you're able to establish something as some sort of home program, just like you would for maybe physical therapy or a rehab program, I think you're going to see a much better, like you mentioned on that, the soft reentry. But as far as red flags, I mean, you're looking for, maybe there's reports of increased pain. Maybe there's, hey, there are kids asking for ibuprofen or medication for pain controlling or icing one specific joint more than something else. So just kind of listening to them, or maybe from a parent perspective, just asking questions about how they're feeling. Are they experiencing aches and pains? So maybe it's more of a verbal questionnaire that you typically wouldn't ask those questions maybe on a necessarily normal basis. But when you're looking at some of those things, those could be important things.
Yeah, Trevor kind of hit on a couple points that I would just add to in terms of the mental fatigue part of it. Again, I'm just going to stress open communication and just asking some of those questions with how your athletes are feeling, right? If you're noticing changes in their behavior, changes in how they're expressing their emotion, right? If they're a little bit more irritable and they're usually not like that, you know, how do we just open up that conversation and ask them how they're doing? Maybe they need to add some other kind of, you know, self-care, just taking a break, whatever it is, into what's happening to kind of break things up for them a little bit. But I think, you know, again, everyone's going to have a different experience, but some of what we're saying, you know, if there is going to be this piece where they might feel behind in terms of what they're used to or where they think they should be at when they come back, they might feel frustrated with that too, right? And they might start worrying about what this is going to mean for my performance and things like that. So again, if we can just have those conversations and kind of help our athletes through that process and kind of normalize it as best as we can with them, I think just having those discussions can be really helpful.
Yeah, I think there's a couple important things there. I think that sometimes when people hear and think about athlete monitoring, they picture it being very invasive and obtrusive, and I think that it can certainly be taken that way. One of the things that I tell people is, as best you can, ideally, you know the training that they've been doing, as well as some of the psychological aspects and some of the outside stressor type stuff. And I think it needs to be framed for the athlete, not in a, you know, I think if done wrong, it can be in a way that makes them feel like guilty for not having quality training and feel bad about it. They can maybe start, this is the most important thing, but not giving you near as good information. And I think when done well and implemented properly, you can have a much better idea of the state of the athlete, what they've been doing. I mean, assessment is great, like a one-time baseline something. But if I had the option of having a good idea of what that athlete's been doing for 5 months versus just that one-time assessment, I'd take the 5 months. I think, you know, ideally we have both. And something that I also think is worth mentioning is I got to work with Dr. Bill Sands for a while when I was doing my doctorate. And one of the things Bill talked about all the time, now he was at the Olympic Training Center, the head of biomechanics, and ran the recovery center. And one of the things that he said was, I mean, you talk about, I think it was Dr. Diefenbach mentioned, sometimes athletes might not be honest about injuries, not tell coaches. Well, he worked mostly with gymnastics. They deal with a lot of bumps and bruises along the way and like to keep it to themselves. He said that with the very simple monitoring, a lot of times they found out about things that were bothering them that athlete had never told sports medicine. And he said the most interesting thing was they made it very clear, like, these are the people that will see this information. This is how it will be handled. This isn't a surprise attack situation. But for whatever reason, they would say things were bothering them, and they were able to address it much, much sooner than they would have been able to address it if it had gotten to the point of, this is so bad, now I got to tell somebody.
This is a good one, looking at it from again, this is going to be more of a coaching administration standpoint. What are some suggestions that you may have in maintaining sanitation in sports where multiple athletes, you know, touch the same piece of equipment, such as a football, basketball?
Well, I think right now, you know, especially at phase one, stuff like that, you're not going to be doing that. I mean, we're looking at more. Phase one is just conditioning, you know, flat out just conditioning, and to where you can social distancing easily, you know, just as long as you educate your athletes of, you know, exactly what you expect of them. And we talked about the football and the basketballs, and, you know, can you really do that? And for right now, I don't have that answer for you. I don't know. That's a question even as an athletic director that I would want to ask the experts. You know, I don't want to make an assumption. You know, what do you do? You know, are you passing that germ along, you know, by catching footballs, and then somebody wipes sweat or puts their hands to them? I think the best thing is just educating our athletes of how to stay as safe as possible while we're working out, while we're trying to condition and work out. And, we talked about our coaches too, and we're working on a policy, but, we need to let our coaches know that, when the athletes, if they do return and we do phase one, is you use a very conservative approach. Everything has to be on a volunteer basis. These kids can't be pressured. If they're not comfortable coming back into that type of environment, that's okay. And we as coaches need to let them know that's okay. And we're not holding anything against them. And then as far as their training goes, it's just a matter of, being smart, your coaches being smart enough to use a progression type level. And what you did last summer at this point, you're for sure not going to be doing this, the same thing as a team at this point, because you haven't seen them. I mean, it's been over 2 months since we've done anything with them, even though we know some of them are working out as a bulk, probably the bulk of them are not.
All right. Well, we're getting close to I want to keep everybody to the hour time limit that we have here, but I want to pose one more question, really across the panel. And if you could give me kind of some quick answers, we'll start with BJ again. What are your biggest concerns professionally about related to return to play?
I think, from looking at it from just a purely medical standpoint, my biggest concern is returning too quickly without the proper guidelines in place. And then we face, a spike in our cases, and then potentially, another or a continuation of an outbreak. And I think most of us, from the medical side would give you that same answer.
I'll just piggyback off of BJ too. One thing I don't think we've touched on is it's one thing to have protocols in place and it's another to apply it. And I think the phasing piece will help with that. But if we even just think back to when we were first told to leave campus, and like kind of go to home, right? And even like one thing as simple from a behavioral health perspective of like, don't touch our face. Like just think about for yourself individually, how hard it was to stop touching your face and probably how long it took you to start changing that automatic habit. So I think there's going to be some things that we're asking our athletes that's going to genuinely be hard for them to do right away because it's so different from what they're used to. Even something as simple as like high-fiving my teammate when we did something well as we start coming back to sport. So I think we just have to be really mindful of like, it's one thing to say that this is what we're going to do, but we have to really be making sure like what that's going to actually look like and how we're putting that into place. I guess that's my one concern too.
Trevor, what's your biggest concern coming back from an athletic training standpoint?
Yeah, I think similar to what BJ was saying, I think part of the biggest thing is we just don't have the answers for people. So I think our athletic trainers are going to get a lot of questions from athletes, coaches, and parents. And the answer to a lot of those is I don't know. At least right now, I think maybe the next month or two with things starting to open back up, we'll have some better answers as far as some of the things go. But as far as, how are our athletic trainers going to be able to work in conjunction with the coaches, with strength and conditioning to manage whether it's the social distancing aspect, figuring out what phase we're going to be in, and finding out if these athletes are comfortable coming back in certain situations. So, when you look at something like a concussion, athletes are hiding those symptoms. So where are they going to be as far as hiding symptoms for respiratory illness? So I think it's going to be very similar as far as some athletes will think it's serious and some won't. So it's going to be very difficult for our athletic trainers to manage those things. It's easy enough to say, hey, if you have a sprained ankle, 2 to 3 weeks, you should be in good shape. Whereas this, the return to play is going to be much more difficult.
If I had to pick something more immediate, I probably would go with the thing I've been thinking about the most often the last couple of weeks, which is I think we really need to do a good job, and maybe in some cases a better job, preparing athletes for how different things might be. And that probably comes more me thinking with the work we do with the high school athletes, because I think there's a lot of stuff out there that is very expect fall to have games and it be somewhat normal. And I think we need to do a better job, particularly with the younger athletes. And, think about high school. It's not like the college kids where they can, NCAA grants them an extra year. If they're a senior, they're a senior. And so I think we really need to start now saying, look, like, this might be awful and we know it is, but start preparing them for what that might be.
Coach Parsons, as a administrator, as a coach, what are your biggest concerns?
Well, one of the biggest concern would be actually having an athlete, contract COVID in one of our sessions. That would definitely be a major concern. But the other thing is, and I like what he said about, now trying to get across to our athletes what to expect. But like with us, it's the parent drop off at practice and the pickup and the athletes and going from point A to point B and having the, making sure our coaches are constantly saying, stay apart, and she made a good point about what they are used to, want to come up and high five. Oh, you just can't do that. And the biggest thing we need to do, and our coaches need to understand, is everything we do, there's no room for error, and we just have to make really, really responsible decisions throughout this transition coming back. And then what the future holds, I mean, it's going to change us. It's going to change the outlook of sports, I think, from now on, just life in general. So anyway, that would be my concerns.
Dr. Diefenbach?
Well, I think we've got the right panel seated here to give some excellent advice and some really great things to think about for everybody. And in echoing some of the things I heard, can we be patient? Can we come back slowly? Can we come back with intelligence and forethought and working together, as opposed to worrying about the competition and all the stuff that we really love about sport? In order to bring it back, in order to move it forward, we have to do it a little bit differently. We have to use our resources, and we can only go as fast as those resources allow. So take your time, take care of each other, and we'll get there. We're resilient. People are resilient. Sport teaches resilience. This is a prime time to really build up a few things that maybe got lost in sport along the way: the fun, the deliberate play, the ability to really do skills development, the ability to prioritize well-being in the quest for peak performance. Let's focus on those things right now and move it forward that way, because I'm concerned that we're going to try to rush.
Well, thank you. I thank everybody on the panel. If at any point in time anybody in the audience has questions for us, or if we can be of some help as the center at some point in time, you feel free to email the center. Our email address and our website is www.appliedcoaching.wvu.edu. We also have some resources that we have put out, and that's what is up here on the screen now. We put out recently just put out an infographic that you can find on the website up there, kind of dealing with some of the major talking points on returning to play. While I have all the panelists here, I want to again thank you for coming out and talking to the crew, talking to everybody in the audience, and thank everybody in the audience for coming out and tuning in today. I'd also like to give a big thank you to Christina, our graduate student, which has been behind the scenes doing a lot of this work in preparation for the talk today. I hope everybody has a good weekend, and we stay on top of the all the emerging information that is coming out about return to play. You are on this talk because you care about sports, because you care about young athletes getting out and having fun, and we all want to get back to that point where sports becomes that enjoyable moment in a kid's life that they can learn some valuable lessons for. And I think this is a prime opportunity where us as parents, coaches, and educators have the ability to step out front and show them what leadership is about. Thank you.
And we will be continuing this series, and if individual organizations or groups are interested in talking to the center about how we can help your sport organization, please reach out to us at info@coachinged.wvu.edu, and we will, coachinged he just read it, it's on there. We're happy to work with you. So thank you everybody for attending.